Um, Next up, we've got Harley Geiger, who will do a fantastic presentation of what's going on in DC. He's given this 2 or 3 times now, and every time it's amazing. He does his own custom art for this, by the way, which is awesome. And if you don't already have posters and you're looking for posters, there might be some poster ideas in here. So everybody, welcome Harley, and listen to what he has to say.
Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. So thanks very much for being here. Thanks, Beau, and for the Hackers on the Hill team for putting on this event and for growing it every year. I mean, when it started, it was much smaller than it is now. So yes, I'm Harley Geiger, and I'm a counsel at Venable, and I'm going to be talking with you about some of the cybersecurity policy issues that we can expect to arise in the next year or so. This is not legal advice. Please do not get me in trouble with my firm. If you need legal advice, I recommend getting a lawyer because they are really great. This will go less than 30 minutes. This is not going to be an overview of every single topic that is going to be discussed on cybersecurity, which is a lot of topics, as you heard Jeff talk about. But we will cover a few issues, special focus on critical infrastructure, as well as cyber incident reporting. We're going to touch on privacy, and then because after all, these are hackers on the hill. We're going to have a bonus on hacker law. I've been told to step closer to the microphone. So, folks that are following policymaking, right? You know that there are common tensions in policymaking, and there is a push for stronger cybersecurity requirements, but there is a counter force, which is fear of the liability that those security requirements bring, as well as the effect that that liability can have on innovation. This is something we all know intuitively, but it is a very powerful force in almost every area of policymaking, including cybersecurity, including in those areas where we may generally accept to be a good area to work on. That concern can lead to federal inaction, right? So where the government is not acting as quickly or as robustly as it ought to, and sometimes when that happens, the states will step in. They have their own legislatures. We're seeing this very much right now on privacy, and also in some areas of data security. And sort of compounding that federal inaction problem is, as I'm sure everybody here knows, the increasing level of partisanship in the government. Right? There is, it's harder to pass anything, even in cybersecurity, which enjoys more bipartisan support than most things. A lot of bandwidth is going to be taken up on things like corruption investigations or the debt ceiling or other forms of political infighting, Hunter Biden's laptop. And it will make it so there is less floor time to pass any kind of bill, cyber or not. These tensions are not new. They may be more exacerbated in 2023 than in previous years, but they're not new. They've always been with us. And the good news is, despite always being with us, there's still action in past years. So I'm going to give you just a quick sort of by the numbers look at the volume of cyber policymaking in the past. So we're presently in the 118th Congress. The 118th Congress is 2023, 2024. The previous Congress, the 117th, was 2021 to 2022. And in the 117th Congress, there were 659 bills with cybersecurity in them somewhere, and 29 passed Congress, became law. So some of the highlights for what actually passed were CERCIA, so that's the Critical Infrastructure Cyber Incident Reporting Act, the Patch Act, which gave the FDA more medical device cybersecurity authorities, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which was a lot of cybersecurity grants for state and local and other sort of critical infrastructure sectors, small business training for our workforce. So there was action, despite there still being a high level of partisanship. The executive branch was active as well. So there, in 2022, 390 notices with cybersecurity in them, 47 of which became regulations, adjusting for a weirdly, every year, large number of drone airworthiness certificates, which for some reason are rules. Highlights there included incident reporting from a whole bunch of regulators, government contractor requirements, and then Greenwich-Bliley, the Greenwich-Bliley safeguards rule, which I think is pretty important. That applies to all non-banking financial institutions. It got a major upgrade. And then the states. So in 2022, about 40 states considered 250-ish cyber bills, and 24 states actually enacted cybersecurity laws. That's half the states. It's a lot going on. The big things there, for the most part, government agency security requirements like incident response plans and training, funding for agencies and schools for cybersecurity and cyber workforce issues. So for additional context, these numbers, which are just the years directly prior to this one, the Congress directly prior to this one, these numbers are more or less on par with what we saw in the years before that. So there hasn't really been a big spike in the past few years or a big decline in the amount, the volume of sort of cybersecurity policymaking. And so with that sort of broad overview, we're going to look at some of the substantive areas, starting with critical infrastructure. It's just not only highly important, but also has I think, a special momentum for change this year, this Congress. There was an old model of regulating many critical infrastructure sectors. And that model was sort of voluntary cybersecurity risk management, rather than a government mandate requiring cybersecurity safeguards. And this has led to, in a lot of sectors, a relatively loose relationship between the critical infrastructure owner and operator and the agencies that are supposed to oversee their cybersecurity, what we call the sector risk management agencies. And I think the exceptions to that are financial industry and the bulk electric power industries tend to be more regulated than most. But there are 16 sectors. The Colonial Pipeline event in 2021 was an eye-opener for a lot of policymakers on the need for critical infrastructure security. And then, of course, at the same time, our healthcare institutions, our educational institutions were being besieged with ransomware. And so I think there's a growing realization within policymaking circles that this has been an emergency for years and that this is affecting services that are necessary for modern human life. And there's increasing sense that this voluntary model we've operated under for a long time is not yielding progress on cybersecurity quickly enough. This is relatively new, this change in mindset. Government moves slowly, but when it does, it has a lot of weight. So there are signs now that government is moving to an emerging model where they will identify the most pressing critical infrastructure sectors and the entities within those sectors, as opposed to sort of treating all critical infrastructure sectors as equal, pressing for sprints to shore up security in key areas, and then using existing regulatory authority where possible, sometimes in creative ways. An example of this is the pipeline directive, where there was existing authority, it just wasn't really being exercised. And now the government is increasingly discussing, broaching the potential for new regulatory requirements and new funding for cybersecurity regulation. So some of the recent actions illustrating this shift. We're still on critical infrastructure. So the White House launched sector sprints under its ICS cybersecurity initiative for the pipeline, electrical, chemical, and water sectors. Agency regulators have issued several rules, including for rail, pipelines, aviation, and the financial sectors. And then federal agencies looking in-house are also driving towards security requirements for their contractors. There's a great deal happening for federal contractors. It's maddening to keep track of, frankly. And federal agencies themselves are required to drive towards a zero trust model by 2024. It's important milestones they have to reach on zero trust by 2024. CISA, for its part, has started its rulemaking to require cyber incident reporting for critical infrastructure. It issued cross-sector cyber performance goals. The cross-sector cyber performance goals are supposed to be a common baseline of cybersecurity practices for critical infrastructure. And they're now working with those sector risk management agencies on sector-specific goals as well. So, big picture, the government is exercising its authority where it has authority. And that is an evolution from the previous mindset on critical infrastructure. So what's next? Some of the upcoming priorities. And you'll see this, I think, very soon. The National Cyber Strategy. This has been a kind of a comes out any day sort of thing. But the National Cyber Strategy will be released soon, perhaps even today. And it will acknowledge the need for new regulation on cybersecurity where voluntary action has failed. My understanding of the current draft is that the sections emphasizing the need for regulation have actually been elevated within the draft from where they were in previous drafts. The White House has also announced additional areas in critical infrastructure for regulatory action. Water, healthcare, outside of HIPAA, and emergency comms. The FDA, now with the passage of the PATCH Act, is poised to be able to deliver new rules on medical device cybersecurity. And Congress is expressing interest on regulating health IT security. We're seeing signals from Senator Warner, as well as several others. So momentum is being built to tackle critical infrastructure cybersecurity in a more direct and a more prescriptive way than in years past. I think this is one of the major shifts that we're seeing this year as opposed to the past couple of years. But all of this is subject to those tensions that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, right? So will Congress be able to cooperate with itself? Is all this going to get derailed by the debt ceiling? Will industry push back on requirements that maybe we all think are good, like being able to get water, and reduce their effectiveness? Will lawsuits, this is a big one, will lawsuits invalidate creative uses of agency authority? It's happened many times before. So we'll have to see. But when you all go to your congressional offices for those small group meetings, and you will have the opportunity to sort of add your weight to the momentum in whatever direction you choose. The stakes are high. Moving on to a somewhat related topic, incident reporting. So the days of simple data breach notification are over. Companies now have to report their cybersecurity incidents to government directly. And the idea here is that the federal government will be able to get visibility into disrupted operations, exposures of sensitive data, discovery of malicious code in supply chains, and other sort of various nefariousness that would not otherwise be covered by data breach rules. Several regulations came out just in the past year, and there will be several more that enter into force this year. So CERCIA is one that will apply to critical infrastructure owners and operators. That's a rule coming out of CISA. The SEC proposed a rule that would apply to all public companies. There are 7 or 8 different financial sector regulators, and all of them are getting in on the cyber incident reporting action. The FCC on the emergency alert system, and then there's several non-US regulators that have published their own as well. The EU, India, Australia, and so forth. So this, it sounds like a patchwork, it's because it is. It is a patchwork. They differ on materiality, like so what should be the trigger? Why, when do you report? A lot of them say it needs to be something significant, it has to be material, but not all of them. Some of them have a much lower bar. They differ on the timeline. A number of them say 72 hours, so like 72 hours after discovering that it's material, but we also see 36 hours, 24 hours, 12 hours, 6 hours, and 30 days. And they also differ on whether the report is confidential. So many of them, most of them, the report is secret, it's a cyber incident that is happening potentially right now, but not all of them. The SEC's proposed rule, for example, would actually make this information public, sort of regardless of whether the incident has been mitigated yet or not. It's a proposed rule. We'll see where they go with it. There's also little reciprocity on this, meaning that companies can be subject to several different regulations, and they have to submit not only their initial cyber incident report, but also follow-up reports to a whole bunch of different regulators, especially if they're a large company that spans multiple sectors. We should all feel bad for those large companies. So in 2023, expect increasing calls for harmonization of incident reporting regulations. It's a rumor that this will also be in the national strategy. We'll find out. But this is a responsibility in large part for CISA as well as NCD, but it is not going to happen overnight. And of course, they don't have direct authority over international regulators. And so sort of uncoordinated incident reporting requirements may just be in our future for some time. Now, the patchwork, to be clear, does not serve cybersecurity, right? Because it takes up resources from incident response. It takes up time and bandwidth 72 hours after discovering that it's significant. There's a lot going on at that time. Plus, I think it's really important to recognize we're not actually making things more resilient by requiring cyber incident reporting. We are increasing transparency, but it's not the same thing as a security safeguard. And transparency is important, but we have to have safeguards as well, which is why, in the context of personal information, despite having breach notification rules, we also have to have privacy rules. To some extent, privacy has been a siren song for at least 15 years at the federal level. In the last Congress, a bill, ADIPA, which is the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, that got further than most. For the first time, it was teed up for a floor vote in the House. This is bicameral, so it was introduced in the House and the Senate. It was bipartisan, but it did not advance further than that. That was about the furthest that a privacy bill has gotten at the federal level. It's going to get reintroduced, if it hasn't been already, in 2023. There will be discussion on it, and we could say, better luck this Congress. For my money, I don't think it's going to happen, simply because there's too many other things going on, too many other things sort of occupying floor time. I'm not sure why this year, where the majorities are thinner and bipartisanship is harder to find, why this would be the year that federal privacy legislation passes. But it's possible. Sort of independently of Congress, the Federal Trade Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau are both working on rulemakings on privacy. And these would be also nationwide. So the FTC's rule would sort of cover cross sectors. The CFPB rule, if they are able to come out with it, would be focused largely on financial privacy and third parties. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, these will take a really long time. So the FTC's rulemaking process for this is going to go on for several years. The CFPB is facing a very serious challenge to its agency funding. So the bottom line is, even if we're looking at the agencies, there will be work, there will be discussion about this in 2023 and beyond. I just wouldn't expect it to get done this year. The states are another matter. So California, Virginia, Colorado, Connecticut, Utah, all have privacy laws that become effective in 2023. So this is one of those areas, right, where the federal gridlock, the federal inaction has led the states to step in with their own processes. This is our wacky federalist system. And the laws that have already been introduced, the state AGs, the attorneys general, are already issuing regulations to implement them. So it is worth working on this. I think the 9th comprehensive bill I read this morning was reintroduced in Massachusetts. So in 2023, in addition to the laws that are now on the books being implemented, we're going to see pushes in other states to have their own comprehensive privacy law, leading to that patchwork again. All of these things are iterative. So even if the federal legislation doesn't pass, we are seeing some state bills borrowing ideas, borrowing provisions from the federal bill. So if you do choose to work on this, focusing sort of squarely on the cybersecurity issues, my recommendation is to look at the personal information security section, right? So privacy and security are overlapping, but personal information security is an important one in every privacy bill. And securing personal information is going to sort of have ripples in the pond that lead to better security elsewhere in the organization. Second is making sure that we are not unduly restricting cybersecurity activities with privacy restrictions. So for example, if I receive a phishing email from somebody and I want to pass it on to a peer company and say, hey, watch out for this phish, I shouldn't be restricted by privacy restrictions for doing that. We should not say, well, the phisher needs to have privacy in the email address I used to phish you with, right? And then the last one, this one is really wonky, but it's also important. So any federal bill is a discussion about what will the effect be on state law. And part of the value of having a federal privacy law is that it sort of makes a uniform set of rules, and so there's a drive to sort of wipe out the state laws. So if you draft that provision that does that too broadly, then you can end up with nullifying a lot of state cybersecurity laws that maybe are not related to privacy. I've seen some preemption provisions that say this preempts all state security law. It's like, well, wait a minute, right? Like that's much broader than privacy. So that is one to pay attention to as well. But for my money, the states are where the action is at on this in 2023. But again, it will be discussed at the federal level. So I promised a quick update on hacker law for the Hill hackers. If you want a more in-depth look at some of the changes on hacker law, I'm going to be speaking on this at ShmooCon tomorrow. I hope you can join us. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the big bad CFA, has seen a lot of changes in the past couple of years. The U.S. Supreme Court in the Van Buren decision was a big one. So there, it said, if you are authorized to use a computer for one purpose, then you use it for an unauthorized purpose, that may not be a federal hacking crime, which is wonderful. Previously, what it came down to was, depending on where you lived, violating a workplace policy or an employment agreement, even if you're authorized to use the computer, could be a hacking crime. Right? The Supreme Court has now sort of cleared the road and said, no, that is not true. That's not how we shall interpret the CFA going forward. I see hackers that the employment agreement thing becomes very real for them when it says, do not hunt bugs on this computer. And they do, because you can't help yourself. And now, if they're authorized to use it in the first place, potentially not a CFA violation. Now, that doesn't mean that you're off scot-free. Some of the limits here are that it does not affect the states. So the state laws, separate from the federal law, CFA is a federal law, so the state laws still often look very much like CFA. Some of them are broader, and are not affected by this sort of reduction in liability. In addition, the toss note there is that the Supreme Court, despite doing this on your seat to authorize access, what it said is terms of service may still dictate whether you have authorization to access a computer in the first place. So here, you still need to have a legit reason to be accessing the computer. The second big one that happened was the Department of Justice changed its charging policy explicitly to protect good faith security researchers, good faith hackers. Their charging policy, and this was pretty recent, just in 2022, the charging policy says that prosecutors should decline prosecuting good faith security researchers for good faith security research. They borrowed language from another rule for that. There are some limits. Again, one is it's just for good faith security research. If you are demanding money, like extortion or something like that, you're not going to qualify. The second is, again, this does not affect the states. Right? So the state law is not affected by the DOJ's charging policy. It may be influential, but it doesn't affect them. And then also, the DOJ just deals with criminal law in this context. Under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, you can get hit with private lawsuits still. And so there is no, you should decline to have a private lawsuit sort of policy that applies to private enterprise if they want to use the CFA to sue. But taken together, that is some very noteworthy progress on the chilling effects in law that we have as a community talked about for many years. My measure, based on the current state of the risks that have changed as a result of these events happening in the past couple of years, my measure is that if you want to make the world safer, for hackers to make the world safer, you probably want to focus on the states. They have not evolved like CFA. Again, many of them, we'll go into depth about it another time, but many of them are even broader than the CFA and have not had a Van Buren ruling, have not had a charging policy change. That may be the greatest source of risk for good faith security research. The second is Section 1201 of the DMCA. There is a trafficking provision for which there is no protection for good faith security research. That trafficking provision says that if you are providing to the public, if you're manufacturing or providing to the public a technology or a service, the primary purpose of which is to circumvent software security safeguards, and you're doing this without the permission of the software owner, then you're in violation of the DMCA. So if you are publishing exploits, if you are a pen testing organization, you are providing this service to the public, and the entire purpose of it is circumventing software security safeguards, which is what you do when you're hacking, then this is a violation of Section 1201. It's sort of an ugly truth that we're all kind of whistling past this liability. But it has been used. There have been folks that have been sued under it very seriously. The third, coordinated vulnerability disclosure. The community only benefits by having more businesses adopt coordinated vulnerability disclosure based on accepted standards and best practices. Federal agencies are way ahead of the game. Actually, a private enterprise in this, they are required to have vulnerability disclosure policies. I mentioned the CFA's private lawsuits. I think that is a much greater risk now than criminal prosecution under CFA. Arguably, it always was, but even more so. And then global laws around vulnerability disclosure. I'm sure that some of you are familiar with China's vulnerability disclosure law, but it is a giant sucking sound of vulnerabilities to the Chinese government. You are restricted as a researcher from publishing your vulnerability to the public. You have to disclose it either to the vendor or to the Chinese government. If you disclose it to the vendor is required to disclose it to the Chinese government. And they're supposed to do that within 2 days. Bug bounties are encouraged, CVDs are encouraged, all of which is great, but it's still a great funnel of disclosures to the Chinese government. And we are seeing some reports, it's very hard to correlate, but there are some reports that have noted an uptick in the number of 0 days used by Chinese state actors since this law has been implemented. So maybe not necessarily a risk for those of us in the United States, but certainly for a large proportion of the world, it's a pretty giant risk in terms of your freedom to disclose vulnerabilities. All right, we're almost finished. We covered a bunch of cybersecurity policy topics that you may encounter this year. I'm going to end with a word of advice on how you advocate on these topics, whatever topic it is that sparks your passion. So, policymakers hear about problems endlessly through in-person meetings, phone calls, tweets, They're not reading your tweets, but just raising a problem and sort of describing, appreciating the problem is only going to get you so far. It's necessary. You have to do it. You have to identify a problem, but it's only going to get you so far. I think, as you heard Jeff describe earlier, don't think of Congress as a monolith. Don't think of the government as a monolith. There are areas of jurisdiction. There's areas of expertise. It's really more like a series of compartments. So don't just complain about the problem sort of into the air. Kevin McCarthy's not going to read your Facebook page. But you can find the staffers, the offices that can actually do something about your problem. This is going to take more legwork on your part. It's an art in itself. But finding them is going to really increase your chances of success. But in the end, we ask our government to come up with solutions, right? We don't just ask our government to complain about things. That's the easy part. So coming up with a solution. So even proposing a solution at all, even if it's a threadbare solution, gets you just a little bit further down the road towards success and progress. And especially so if it's a solution that works for all of society. Policymakers have to work with constituents and balance a lot of other interests outside of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity may be what we all care about here, but some people care about things like healthcare. Some folks do. I don't understand. And then, if you have a workable solution to a real problem that you brought to the right people, then your goal is to make measurable progress on that solution. And that's really where the journey begins. So thank you. Best of luck later today. Here we go.